Welcome. So good to be with you on this Wednesday as we get together for a little midweek Bible study and devotional time. And I'm so glad you've taken some time out of your day, out of your week to join us to dive into God's word and hopefully be uplifted and encouraged and challenged by what he has to say to us. Have you ever been to like a party or a get together and when you're there, they ran out of something, or maybe you were hosting something and you ran out of something essential? I remember one time we had some people over for a cookout. It wasn't a real big thing or anything like that, but just a few people over, a couple families over, and so I fired up the grill to cook some food. I think it was like hot dogs and hamburgers or something like that. And so put the meat on the grill, cooking it, and like a few minutes in, the flame goes out. It was a gas grill, and the flame goes out, and I check some things and pretty quickly realized that I had run out of gas. The propane tank had run out of gas. Unfortunately, I did not have a backup tank. Now, we were able to just kind of take the hot dogs and hamburgers inside and, cook them on the stove and, in the microwave or whatever we did with the hot dogs. And so it wasn't like a huge deal, right? But it was definitely an inconvenience. And by the way, I did not make the mistake of not having an extra tank again. I always make sure I have that. But that's another story, for another day. But the point is, I ran out of something that was quite essential, and it was definitely an inconvenience. Now, in John chapter 2, there's a story about Jesus and his disciples at a wedding. And so imagine that same kind of problem, running out of something, except way, way worse than that, right? And so instead of a cookout, you've got a wedding. And instead of running out of gas to cook, they ran out of wine. And in first century Jewish culture, running out of wine wasn't just an inconvenience or a pain in the backside like it was for me. It was really a disaster and an embarrassment of kind of the highest order when it came to hospitality and having guests over. That was a huge no-no in that culture and in that time. Running out of wine, uh, on top of being an embarrassment, was basically symbolic that the life and the joy had run out of the party. That the celebration was basically over, and now the family's got to live with the embarrassment, not only in the moment, but probably for years to come. And it's just it's a colossal disaster, right? And it's in that moment right there, in that moment of emptiness and feeling helpless, probably, that Jesus steps in. Although, I guess technically, first of all, it's Mary, Jesus's mother, who steps in first. She's the one who notices the problem, and she quietly brings it to Jesus. And then after a little interaction between the two of them, she then instructs the servants nearby with what I think are some of the most profound words in the entire passage. And not going to talk about a whole lot of that tonight, but she tells them, do whatever he tells you to do. And I just want to say that's probably the best advice that I can give you when it comes to following Jesus. Just do whatever he tells you to do. And I know it's easier said than done, but if you want to start somewhere, that's a good place to start. So she tells the servants, do whatever he tells you to do. We're told in the passage in John 2 that nearby there are six large jars, stone jars, that were used typically for ceremonial washing and cleansing, like before you ate, each holding, we're told, between 20 and 30 gallons. And so Jesus tells the servants, I want you to fill the jars with water. They do, all the way to the brim. He then says, now take some out, draw some out, he says, and take it to the master of the banquet, which if I'm one of the servants, I'm like, I just filled that with water, not wine, right? So what's going on there? What is it that they're taking? At any rate, they do. They listen, they obey, and they take it to the master of the banquet. The master tastes it, and he says, shockingly, probably to all of them, except for Jesus, right? He's not shocked at all. Everyone brings out, this is what the master says, everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best for last. And I love how John kind of wraps up this miracle. He says in verse 11 of John chapter 2, this was the first of Jesus' signs that he did in Cana and Galilee that revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Now, it's interesting because this miracle, especially compared to, many of the other miracles that Jesus does, is not a crisis of death or of danger or some severe medical condition, right? But it's more in a moment of just embarrassment, which is not insignificant, but maybe comparatively a little bit less than those, just some wine running out at a party, right? And I don't want to overplay some of this, but I also think it does speak a little bit into and tells us something, a little bit of something powerful, I think, about Jesus, that he doesn't just show up in our emergencies, right? But he shows up in our everyday lives. And in the seemingly mundane, not that a wedding is necessarily mundane, not going there, but in our everyday activities and lives and celebrations. And so as to the story itself, I think that's interesting. But as to the story itself, Mary, it's interestingly, she doesn't panic. She does what I think is probably the first and best response to do when we are created or experiencing a crisis, or in the face of a crisis. She simply brings the problem to Jesus. That's a good place to start, right? And it's interesting. She doesn't tell him how to fix it. She just says they have no more wine, which I think in some ways maybe some of our best prayers sound like, or at least our most honest prayers sound like that. Lord, I've run out. I'm out of fill in the blank, right? I'm out of patience. I'm out of strength. I'm out of direction. And whatever it may be that we're out of, maybe multiple things, Jesus meets us there in our desperation and in our lacking. And I love what the psalmist says in Psalm 34. Those who seek the Lord lack no good thing, because Jesus meets us there and provides what we need. And so when your joy runs out, that's not the end of the story, right? That's where Jesus begins to work. It's actually the start in many ways of your story. And when he works and he moves in our lives, he doesn't just give us enough to get by, to survive. He gives us the best. He gives the best of himself, and he gives the best to us. He gives in fact, the best of the best, if you will. And when we follow him, we discover that his timing, his plan, and his provision are better than anything that we could have arranged on our own. When Jesus fills your life, he doesn't just restore what's missing, right? He redefines it. He speaks new life into it and turns it into something so much better. Speaking of turning one thing into another thing and turning it and making it so much better, John calls this miracle a sign. He doesn't just call it a miracle, he calls it a sign, because it's revealing something. I think John does so for a very important reason, because he wants us to realize that the things Jesus does, and specifically here this miracle in Cana, and others that are throughout the book of John, they're teaching us something. They're revealing something, and pointing forward to something. And so at this wedding, Jesus transforms water, used for outward cleansing in this case, into wine, which is a symbol of inward joy and salvation. And actually, years later, at the Last Supper, Jesus would take a cup of wine, and he would say in Luke chapter 22, verse 20, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you." And of course, he would go on to pour out his blood on the cross for you and for me, and for all, even those that were at that wedding, and everywhere throughout the time of history. And so, even in this first miracle, even this seemingly mundane, what's the whole point of it miracle, Jesus was foreshadowing and pointing forward toward the ultimate transformation, the cross, where he would turn sin into salvation and death into life. And that same Jesus is still in the transformation business today. So do what he tells you. As Mary said, do what as she told the servants, do what he tells you to do, and trust that when he, Jesus, transforms, he brings the best. Hope you have a blessed day. God bless.